Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the Ancient World Magazine podcast. Today we're going to be talking about sanctuaries in ancient Greece. And because it's been a while, let's introduce ourselves again.
Hello, my name is Matthew Lloyd. I am a specialist in early Iron Age archaeology.
Hello, I'm Joshua Hall, and I am primarily a Romanist, but I also study the Greeks in Sicily and Magna Graecia.
And my name is Josho Brouwers, and I'm also an archaeologist, and I focus on early Greece from the Bronze Age, especially late Bronze Age, to the Archaic period. To start off, I think it's a good idea to define the word sanctuary, which is a very generic term to denote a space set apart for cult. And that automatically leads to the question, what's a cult? And a cult is basically religious devotional practices, or as the dictionary defines it, a system of religious veneration and devotion directed towards a particular figure, such as a deity, or an object. A cult is embodied in ritual and ceremony. And when we refer to rituals, you have to think about stuff like prayers, processions, sacrifices, initiations, and festivals, and all that sort of stuff gets wrapped up in a spatial sense with sanctuaries.
So would a sanctuary then be mostly the focus of a cult?
Yeah, but cult isn't necessarily focused on sanctuaries alone, because you also have, the old chestnut that ancient Greek religion is embedded in society, because the ancient Greeks didn't think of religion as something that's separate from everyday life. So the gods were everywhere, in springs and trees and the sky and mountains and under the ground. So gods could be worshipped at different levels. So they didn't just worship gods at sanctuaries or, whatever, but they would also worship them within the home. So if you were cooking a meal, for example, you would throw some of the food into the fire as an offering to Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, and that sort of stuff. So sanctuaries aren't the only place where Greeks practiced their religion, let's say. That's
probably good to keep in mind, especially for listeners who aren't necessarily Greek religion specialists.
Unlike everyone here in the podcast.
So specialized in Greek religion. I think something we ought to define, we cover quite a broad swathe of history among our specialisms, and what a sanctuary looks like across those centuries changes quite drastically, even within individual sanctuaries, or sanctuaries that we know to be important at certain points. So we'll look at somewhere like Olympia that looks very different in the late Bronze Age than it does by the 5th century, when it's really at the peak of what we recognize as Olympia today.
That makes sense. Maybe it would be good, especially for Josho, to talk about, or, well, both of you, I guess, like early Greek sanctuaries, late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, just as a precursor.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, one of the main discussions focuses on the lack of temples in the form of monumental cult buildings, basically, in the Aegean Bronze Age. If you look at the late Bronze Age, you have like rooms within larger structures that are set apart for cult, and then, they're usually just referred to as sanctuaries in a generic sense. Cult rooms, often with benches where there were figurines put on the benches for worship, or they may have represented the worshippers themselves, not always entirely clear. A good example is the so-called town shrine in Gornia in Crete, which is Mycenaean in quotation marks. It's sort of at a high location in the town, and it's like this single room with a bench along one side where there were figurines at one point. So that's a cult place. Also in Knossos, of course, and Mycenae, you have places that were clearly dedicated to cult practices, but they weren't temples in the sense that they lacked monumentality, and they may not have necessarily housed a cult statue. And then from about the post-palatial period, especially in Crete, you get buildings that are freestanding and set aside for religious purposes, like the peak sanctuaries in the Dark Ages. Some people start referring to those as temples of a sort, but it's a bit difficult. You have the so-called temple in Mycenae, of course, around in the 13th century BC, which is this structure with a cult space, but also stairs leading up to a storage area. Also with a bench downstairs, which is referred to as the temple, even though it's part of a larger structure again. So for the Bronze Age, we don't know exactly the the details about religious life back then, because we just don't have the sources. A lot of the time people interpret the Aegean religion in the light of later mythology, and that might be misleading.
One of the things we find in the post-glacial period, so this is the traditionally defined as sort of 1200, the 12th century BC, where the palaces have been destroyed, but something that looks very Mycenaean continues. The pottery is still decorated in much the same way, still a lot of use of chamber tombs and multiple burial and inhumation rather than cremation in terms of burial practices. So we're still stuck on a lot of things that are visible in the Palatial Bronze Age in this period. What we find is that people are doing similar things, but because the social structure has been so affected by the removal of the highest class, whatever that means in practice. So activities like religion, like cult practice, what we know about them, they're not changing entirely because people are trying to make them change. It's just a matter of their focus was, well, as we said, embedded in society. They were connected to the fact that you had this Wanax or whoever at the top of society, that they were focused in on the palaces, and now those are gone, so you have to replace them. You have to fit it into your changing social structure. So Josho mentioned the temple at Mycenae. You have a similar thing happening at Tiryns, where you have another building built on top of the Megaron in inverted commas. It's sort of a Homeric word we use for the Mycenaean palace, but built on that central building that potentially is a religious structure. Certainly this is about the site that 500 years later a temple of Hera would be built, but in the post-palatial period it could be sort of a political structure, a place where the rulers are dwelling, or it could be a religious structure, and those changes in social structure are affecting religion. And that's one of the questions that researchers in that period have to ask. There is a question of what kind of continuity do we have from the Bronze Age? Josho mentioned sort of reconstructing things based on myth, and we do have evidence for several of the gods known from later Greek, historical Greek. We know many of the gods' names also exist in Linear B tablets, but we don't really know how those gods connect to the gods as we understand them, starting in the 8th century, 7th century with Homer and Hesiod, and actually seeing the gods as we recognize them from ancient Greek history appearing in a form that is recognizable.
One thing that I wanted to say was about the rulers' dwellings being connected to religious structures, because that's the main thesis in Alexander Mazarakis-Enian's PhD thesis from rulers' dwellings to temples, where he argues the point that the temples from the 9th, 8th century BC in particular develop out of these homes for rulers. And he also emphasizes, and this you can also extend this back into the Bronze Age, that the homes of rulers were not just places where the rulers lived, or in the case of the Mycenaean Magaro, the throne room where the ruler dwelled and may have received people, but were probably also a focal point for religion, for cult practices. And there's ample evidence that the Mycenaean Wanax, for example, we have references to his religious functions in the Linear B tablets, as well as the economic functions, but not his political functions as such. And that's an important thing to point out, I think, if you want to sort of link this idea, this development of these ruler dwellings into temples over the course of the late Bronze Age, certainly the Dark Age, into the Archaic period. One of the things that is often emphasized, probably not correctly, is that the Mycenaean Magaro, the very basic structure of a square or rectangular room, sometimes with an anteroom and a porch, is the same basic structure that you later see in Greek monumental temples. Now, this might just be because it's an obvious shape to use, but some people have suggested maybe it's some sort of link between these types of structures?
It's kind of an interesting question because you think about it and it's like it's a square room with a porch. It doesn't seem like the most complicated structure.
No, exactly.
Imaginable. So the potential for coincidence there, it seems quite strong. When you get to, from what I can remember of Mazarakis' thesis, one of the key sites is Eretria, where you have the temple of Apollo Daphneforos. There are a number of earlier structures that look very much like their domestic settings, these sort of rulers' dwellings, and this site becomes, within a couple of centuries of those buildings, a very clear sanctuary. So one of the reasons why this theory holds weight is that there is this sort of location continuity between where rulers' dwellings are in the early Iron Age and where sanctuaries within settlements, within what we would later call a polis, develop, and where the rulers' dwellings were. And this is also true of many of the palaces. So the palaces at Mycenae and Tiryns we've already mentioned, and also in Athens, there's never quite sure how good the evidence for a palace on the Acropolis is. I think people seem fairly strongly convinced of that now, but that's certainly sort of a site where they built the palaces is where classical and earlier Greeks built their temples and sanctuaries. So how far that's continuity and how far that is the place of these structures in society and life. The Acropolis in Athens is certainly a very obvious massive rock in the middle of the settlement on which you would expect something important to get built. Pretty similar at Mycenae and Tiryns, like these are obvious raised areas where you would expect something important to go. Same sort of thing at Thebes. So yeah, you really have to start interrogating the early Iron Age evidence to figure out how this works in terms of continuity, how this works in terms of these spaces changing from political through residential to religious, and whether you can even divide those terms is sort of a big question in that development.
There's a similar problem in early Rome. I don't know if this is the right place interjected, but by the late Republic there was a structure that was remembered as the Hut of Romulus. That was supposedly, his little house up on the hill, but it was essentially a shrine to Romulus as, like, the founder of, the traditional founder of the city. But whether or not it really was, I mean, it almost certainly was not Romulus's house or anything like that. But it's an example of how these things can progress in a city-state culture or in a territorial state culture, even as later Rome was, that you have something like a Megaron, a Mycenaean Magaron surviving into later periods, and so many stories get built up around it that all of a sudden it takes on much more or a much different function than it used to. And I have a feeling that in at least a few places that you guys are talking about, this kind of process probably took hold.
Yeah, it's sort of going slightly off on a tangent, of course, but it sort of ties into the whole idea of the historicity of or the supposed oral traditions that Homer was a part of. I mean, there's usually this idea that Homer has these memories from the Mycenaean era that he's incorporated into his story about the Trojan War. But of course, in 700 BC, when he's supposed to have lived, the ruins of Mycenae were still visible. So he could have just deduced, or someone could have deduced from the fact that there were these massive walls that, there must have been something important there at some point.
Massive walls, the Tholos tombs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
things.
in the 8th century, you get people worshipping the Bronze Age tombs, basically. And in the historical period, the grave circle A at Mycenae, they found actually, I think it was a potsherd or a plaque or something. It had writing on that said something along the lines of "for the hero." So also the grave circle A in historical times was worshipped in classical times as this place where clearly the heroes of old had lived. So it's not such a great leap to say that the Greeks, like the Romans, constantly reused all the things that they saw that clearly didn't belong to their own time, but they imagined belonging to some earlier era, and then obviously they refer back to stuff that they knew. So, those massive walls around Mycenae must have belonged to a legendary king, and the grave circle must have been the tomb of a great hero, and these giant bones that we've just unearthed must have belonged to Orestes in the Athenians' case, and that sort of stuff. Say whether something is really continuity or just people continuously reinterpreting something that they find and then reusing it and then adopting it, what Matt also said, adapting it to their own purposes and continuously reinterpreting it. That's something that continuously happens all through this period. The type of religion that the Mycenaeans had in the 13th century BC is probably very different from what the Greeks believed around 1000 BC, and is very different from what they believed around 700 BC, no doubt. But they constantly reuse and change and shift and reappropriate the past, and that's continuously in flux, basically. So also your example of the Hut of Romulus is very illustrative to that point. Of course, they found something, and they were like, "Oh, this looks old. This isn't how we build now. This must be Romulus's hut."
You actually did, though, bring up something that I was going to try to lead into with that, because you just mentioned that that potsherd that said "to the hero" or whatever at Mycenae. It might be good to clarify right now that hero cult itself was something that isn't necessarily distinct from wider Greek religion. And it might be worth talking a little bit about the idea of hero cult.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and not just hero cult, also ancestor worship in general, of course. I mean, it's not just venerating the gods, it's also venerating natural spirits, it's also venerating ancestors.
Or specific people, like you noted, Orestes, the supposed giant bones of Orestes that were worshipped, basically. Are there distinctions between what we think of when we talk about Greek religion and like the issue of hero worship or ancestor worship, or do they all essentially fit under the umbrella of Greek religion that most people talk about?
They're all different aspects of basically the same thing. You also have in the colonies, for example, what the settlements abroad that the Greeks found in Italy and elsewhere. They also venerate the oikists, the founders of the colonies, as something akin to hero worship. You also have stuff like Eretria, the West Gate, where we found cemeteries where there's also clearly hero worship going on at some point. The hero worship, I guess it's closer to funerary cult than the cult associated with the gods, because the heroes are supposed to have died. So that makes it more of a funerary cult than a religious cult as such. So than just cult for the deities. So I think that's an important difference. And the same applies for the oikists, the founders of these settlements abroad that are also a form of hero worship, which hero worship is essentially a type of ancestor worship to some degree. So I guess there's a distinction to be made there, at least, between worshipping the gods and worshipping people that have died.
It's worth pointing out that virtually everything we've discussed so far has talked about sanctuaries within settlements. And there are, generally speaking, we have these sort of three broad categories of sanctuaries that we talk about from the 8th century mostly. The urban sanctuaries, which are these sanctuaries in the middle of the settlement, the extra-urban or suburban sanctuaries that are around the outskirts or going out into the territory of the settlements, and the interurban sanctuaries, which are often the very famous Panhellenic sanctuaries, that are sanctuaries between settlements that aren't that are usually associated with a single settlement, but what actually goes on there is tied more to inter-community relations. So we talk about these temples to Hera in Mycenae and Tiryns, and the Acropolis in Athens, and these are very much the city sanctuaries, the focus of the local population, and there are many other sanctuaries in most of these settlements. But then you add further, in Argos in the Argolid, you have the Argive Orion. In Athens or in Attica, you have places like the temple of Sanctuary of Artemis at Brauron, and Eleusis, Sanctuary of Demeter with its famous mysteries. And then you get a bit further out, and in the Peloponnese you have Olympia and Delphi, and more complicated, perhaps, cases like Isthmia, which is very much a Corinthian sanctuary, but that, at least in the historical period, I'm not entirely sure of the early history there, but that has Panhellenic games. So I wonder if we want to step back, if we're talking about Iron Age things and origins, and go back to sort of looking at early Olympia and what happens, what we know about in Olympia, and how that sanctuary becomes more important.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because Olympia's the earliest cult evidence there dates back to the Mycenaean era.
A big difference between Olympia and Delphi is to do with landscape. So I'm going to assume most of our listeners have not been to Olympia or Delphi, and it's been 14 years since I went to Olympia, and 10 since I last went to Delphi or something. So I'll see how well I do with this. But a big difference, Delphi is in the mountains, is on a very steep slope, built on rocky ground, and therefore the archaeological evidence for early activity there is less substantial. It just there's less space for it to be, because you hit the bedrock pretty quickly. At Olympia, it's not flat, it's a river valley with hills, but it is, earth. It's, you don't hit, I don't know how deep the bedrock is, but it's not like immediate, so you have more stratigraphy there. You have more chance for earlier layers to survive.
Yeah, there's loads of riverine sedimentation, basically.
Yeah, and Olympia has had extensive excavations for more than a century. Not 2 centuries, but going back into the 19th century, Olympia has been well excavated. So you do have spaces like the Temple of Zeus and the running track, where you don't necessarily have deep excavations, but then you have other areas where they have excavated back and found the Bronze Age evidence. It is, I think, there is a question here about continuity. I think with absolute certainty we can talk about activity that looks religious going back to the 10th century. Where we have Mycenaean activity, we don't know that continues. And a big part of this is that you can get religious activity anywhere in most of the ancient world. So the fact that you have cultic or religious-looking activity doesn't necessarily mean this is a sanctuary. But from sort of the 10th century onwards, there's sort of a clear idea that what is happening in Olympia is religious, and that religious activity seems to be the surrounding settlements coming together to worship together. It's a regional sanctuary from as far back as we can see, with the people of Elis and Arcadia, presumably, because those are the nearest sort of regions, coming together and working things out, working out how they relate to one another. And this sort of intercommunal spirit, I guess, is something that becomes important in making Olympia a major sanctuary going forward.
You're correct in that it starts small and becomes more of a regional center, and then as time goes on it grows into this larger sanctuary that basically caters to the entire Greek world. And of course, according to Greek historians, the first Olympiad was organized in 776 BC. That's often in conventional accounts taken as the start of Greek history, let's say. But the evidence that Catherine Morgan, among others, has examined in detail shows that in the 8th century BC, Olympia is still very much a regional sanctuary, not a truly Panhellenic one, and it doesn't really become one until, let's say, halfway through the 6th century BC, if we're being generous, which is around the same time that we also see the emergence of these other 3 Panhellenic sanctuaries. So aside from Olympia, we have, like you mentioned, Delphi, where they organize Pythian games. We'll talk about the games in a moment. We have Nemea with the Nemean games, and we have Isthmia with the Isthmian games. And 3 of those are in the Peloponnese. Delphi isn't. So there's something going on here where they organize these, where they have these larger sanctuaries where they organize games, festivities, let's say, for the whole of the Greek world to come together during that particular year to celebrate and compete with each other in multiple ways. But that Panhellenic element that doesn't really show up as far as the archaeological evidence shows until the later 6th century BC.
Something that's important to think about when considering that growth in the Panhellenic element is that Olympia in the 8th century sees a huge growth in dedications. We see this in pretty much every sanctuary, from the small urban sanctuaries to these later Panhellenic ones. And in that evidence, we have a pretty good idea that in the 8th century, bronze workers from the Argolid are working at Olympia. And Josho mentioned that these sites are all in the Peloponnese. I mean, Olympia is, I guess, probably the most difficult to access from any part of Greece that isn't in the Peloponnese. It's the furthest west. It's not on the coast. Nemea and Isthmia are both sort of nearly coastal. Delphi, pretty similarly. But it is getting in people from further across the Peloponnese. We are seeing the Argives coming from the Argolid, not just sort of the local Eleans and Arcadians. And so we have these sites that already have a significant role in inter-community relations, and when they become Panhellenic, when we start to use that word, that's really a growth from where they were before that is connected to that importance. That is more people seeing this as somewhere important to go, and so it grows in that way, I guess would be a good way of putting it. And that's why there is a question of when can we really call Olympia a Panhellenic sanctuary, because it is growing in this way. It is, although Elis appears to dominate it for most of the historical period, Elis is never a particularly significant settlement in terms of its own territory or historical memory about it, which means that there's no real contest over controlling the sanctuary. It's somewhere that everyone gets to go and be on presumably roughly equal footing.
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, that the increase that you mentioned of dedications of objects at the sanctuaries, what you see with all sanctuaries from the 8th century BC onwards, basically, is that it goes hand in hand with a decrease in the number of the wealth of the grave goods in cemeteries, at least for central and for most of central and all of southern Greece, basically, where you see that, for example, grave goods that include weapons and armor, they disappear basically towards the end of the 8th century BC, and weapons and armor instead are dedicated at the sanctuaries at Olympia, but also smaller sanctuaries like Kalapodi and so on. There's something going on here where there's sort of a change in how these sort of items are displayed from being deposited in tombs as part of a larger funerary rite, of course, where you bury somebody, a high-ranking person, you dedicate these weapons there, to moving this dedication of these weapons and armor to the sanctuaries and large bronzes and other vessels and that sort of thing.
It's an interesting phenomenon, especially thinking of places like Olympia as Panhellenic, because obviously a lot of those weapons being dedicated were used against other Greeks, and suddenly they're going from an individual grave that is going to be associated with, again, an individual and the polis that they lived in, to being dedicated in a very public space, saying, oh, look at what was used in war to kill that guy's family over there who's also visiting the sanctuary. Obviously this gets even more interesting as we see monumentalization, especially like at Olympia, which I think by the early 5th century, almost all of the terraces for the treasuries were built up by then already. And it's a very strange phenomenon to me, thinking of it on a very basic level, that we refer to these, and rightly so, as Panhellenic sanctuaries, but they were used to celebrate on many occasions Greeks killing Greeks.
Yeah, that's the weird thing, but they didn't say we killed so and so. Usually the inscriptions, when they are there, they're more general, like this is what the Athenians took from the Spartans, that sort of stuff.
Unless you were a Danomenid tyrant, and of course you have to single out your enemies, those damned Etruscans and Carthaginians.
Yeah. So I would also add to this, when we talk about inscriptions identifying the dedicants of these objects, we're talking about the mid-6th century and later. We don't have inscriptions on the early dedications at Olympia. And also note, bringing up Kalapodi, there is, I can't remember the exact dates, but in the 8th century, one of the temples at Kalapodi burns down, and inside it there are something like 12 swords and no armor. And then with the new temple that's built after that, we start to get more dedications of armor. This is part of various changes happening alongside this change from burials to sanctuaries as the place where you get rid of your wealth, I guess, is one way of looking at it. But with these early dedications, we don't have the evidence to say that this is being dedicated on behalf of this city who defeated this other city. We may find, or it could be argued, as some of us may have done in forthcoming works, that these early dedications may well be dedications on behalf of individuals, of things individuals get from the battlefield. But what matters here is that when things are buried as part of funerary rites, that's sort of something happening at the end of your life on a local scale in your town, presumably. When you dedicate something at a sanctuary, this is sort of an ongoing process of your achievements, of your devotion, perhaps, to the gods. But it can still be about you as an individual who has to operate on a wider scale as the things sort of start to become more active. So if you go back and listen to our podcast on networks, I'm sure we must have discussed this then, about how with the early Iron Age, what you see is sort of a decrease in the intensity of movement across the Mediterranean, and it really picks up from the 9th century. Different people in different regions move around more, and Kalapodi, we should mention, is much the same as Olympia for the region it's in, I want to say East Locris, but it could be in Focus. It's in one of Focus or East Locris. But you find there it has people coming from both of those regions and people coming from Euboea and so on. And it is another one of these regional sanctuaries where in the 8th century, people from a bit further away start going there. But earlier it already had that going on more locally. And this is sort of indicative of people's worlds becoming wider. People going out and interacting with people from a much wider sphere. And as that happens, you kind of need to stake your claim to people who aren't going to know you or see you regularly. So when you go to an interregional, soon-to-be Panhellenic sanctuary to stake your claim to being a person of importance, you kind of have to do it while you're alive and say, here is something I did, and this is why I matter. A big point about this is that what Josh was saying about things changing to be more civic, this is a part of an argument we get into a lot here about the emergence of hoplite warfare supposedly in around 700, or something that has not really been addressed much in on the side of this debate that we all tend to fall on, alongside Hans van Wees, that is sometimes called the revisionist view or the new orthodoxy or whatever you end up calling it, but the belief that the hoplite and phalanx are much later developments, what with the words themselves not appearing till the 5th and 4th centuries in meaningful ways. Something that really hasn't been part of that argument is what it means that these dedications change in the 8th century, that we stop getting burials with weapons and start getting dedications at sanctuaries, and what that means for warfare, given that we don't actually seem to see too much of a change in the actual practice of warfare. But yeah, that's something that needs teasing out. Like we assume that these dedications have this polis-based significance because that's what they have 150, 200 years later when we start getting inscriptions. But that is 150 to 200 years later when we start getting inscriptions that they have that meaning. Whether or not we can attribute that to a very different social setting 150 years earlier is debatable. So,
in addition to that, you have, of course, in the when we do get inscriptions, there are also other objects that are dedicated by people, and those tend to be individual, or they include individuals as well. Like bronzesmith so-and-so dedicates this as a tithe to the deity, whatever, a metal vessel or whatever, and people dedicating other things in their own name to the deity. So yeah, one thing maybe we should talk about, because we've mentioned different elements already from sanctuaries. I mean, Josh also mentioned the treasuries, is maybe to sort of look at the sanctuary from an architectural point of view, or from a spatial point of view, because you already said, a sanctuary is basically a sacred space, but in this particular case, like with Olympia, would be a good example. The sanctuary itself consists basically of a sacred precinct, the temenos, usually divided from the rest by a low wall or ditches or whatever. It's usually set apart with specific entrance areas where basically you go from the world of the profane to the world of the sacred, and within this sacred precinct, which is basically all in the open air, you have all these different elements. So you have an altar, which is the focal point for cult practices basically, and then you have temples, which are places where you house the gods, and then you have also other buildings and other spaces that you can use, like what was already mentioned, a racetrack for runners, or a theater to perform plays, which were also dedicated to the gods, and of course the treasuries that Josh mentioned, which communities built basically to safeguard their offerings, because especially in places like Olympia and other popular sanctuaries, sometimes the offerings grew so large in number that the priests periodically had to dig deep trenches and then dump all the stuff in there so that there would be space for people to put more offerings up for the deities, which is how we get a lot of the stuff that we find as archaeologists. So that's sort of briefly to sketch for listeners what we're talking about in a spatial / architectural sense when we refer to these sanctuaries, at least from let's say the 8th, 7th century BC onwards, and especially later the 6th, 5th centuries.
It should be pretty easy to Google map of Olympia or map of the Acropolis and get a picture of sort of one architectural phase of what those sites looked like. Something perhaps we could get into now is how certain aspects of these developed, like specifically the temple, let's say. So we've discussed this idea of rulers' dwellings and temples, and early temples that we know about are some of them square rooms with a porch. The earliest ones are often apsidal. That means the far end from the porch is rounded off, and they generally get longer rather than wider, particularly. And you reach a point where there's the hectompedon, the 100-foot temple. And this is, if you think of a Greek temple generically, you're probably thinking of something like the Parthenon, or the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, or the Hephaestion in the Agora in Athens, where you have a peristyle around the outside of columns. This is a later development, I want to say 6th century, but it is
possibly late 7th.
Late 7th, 6th century, and earlier than that, and even going later than that. So the Temple of Nike on the Acropolis from the 5th century is still just a square room with a porch at the front with a couple of columns in it. That's really just, this architectural elaboration is as much about decoration as function. Some of it is functionality. Many temples from the 6th century start to have a rear porch for storing things as well. What I was thinking about when I introduced this is an interesting factor about Olympia is that the first temple built there is not to Zeus. It is the Temple of Hera. And there is a question there, why does Hera get a temple before Zeus? I believe Catherine Morgan suggests that it's a temple to Hera and Zeus, which I can't disprove, but I think is maybe less interesting.
Do we have any other examples of a temple dedicated to both of them?
Not that I can think of off the top of my head. But I mean, you'd encounter the same sort of question, or potentially the same sort of development, where the temple becomes just to Zeus or just to Hera, perhaps. I can't think of many temples dedicated to more than one god.
I can't think of any, actually.
In Greece.
Well, you have for the Bronze Age, you have references in Linear B tablets where they refer to offerings made for all the gods, which suggests that there may have been a shrine dedicated to all the deities, whoever they were.
Well, I mean, those aren't unknown from the ancient world, though. Temples dedicated to all the gods.
Yeah, there's the Hellenion at Naucratis.
But in Greece itself,
Yeah.
I can't think of anything.
What we do find looking elsewhere is that many of the early temples are to Hera at Pericora in Corinth, the aforementioned temples at Tiryns and Mycenae. But another common early god to get a temple is Apollo at Eretria and somewhere else, maybe Delphi. Sure, somewhere else there's an early Apollo temple. So perhaps it is just
Corinth has the
Corinth.
The earliest stone temple from the late 7th century, from which
Right.
virtually nothing remains except the foundation. What you can see now dates to the 6th century. The columns. That's an early temple to Apollo. Yeah. So, but maybe to go back to your Hecatompedon, the fact that they made these temples, which were made completely from perishable materials, like the buildings from that time, were so wattle and daub and wood and that sort of stuff, and of course thatched roofs. The fact that they made them longer instead of wider, because there was a limit to how wide they could make these buildings because of the thatch roofs and the wooden beams that they had to use. It's easier to build them longer than it is to build them wider. So you don't really get a movement towards a more squat building, let's say, which is also wide, until you have stone architecture, when the Greeks start using post and lintel systems, as they did in the Bronze Age also. And in the case of the stone temples, they may have borrowed or may have been inspired by Egyptian temples when they started building them again, and they figured out, if we have these large stone blocks and we stack these on columns spaced apart and use walls and use tiled roofs instead of thatched roofs, so we can make these roofs shallower and thereby also wider. That's when you really start getting this attempt to make these temples broader instead of just longer and deeper, basically.
Why are there temples? So something we should probably loop back to, perhaps not immediately, but after what I was going to get into, is the altar. But before getting to the altar, coming back to the temple, like, why is there a temple? And one of the reasons for this is that it is a house for the cult statue.
Cult statues are interesting if you go back to the Bronze Age, you have like these little terracotta statues, and maybe like in Mycenae, the face the stucco face that they've discovered that may belong to a goddess or a sphinx. We don't know precisely. Yeah, exactly. So for the Bronze Age, we don't have a lot in the sense of a proper cult statue, just figurines for the most part, and they may have had statues made from wood. We don't know. We know from later historical texts that the Greeks also venerated these so-called zoana, which were wooden cult statues. But at some point they start making these stone statues. There are some of the early hecatompedons have like these bases in them. I think Samos has one. The hecatompedon in Samos has like this base hidden behind all the central pillars that hold up the roof. So you can't really see it. You sort of have to go into the building and then go to the end and then look around the pillar, and then you might have been able to see the cult statue. So that's another reason probably why the stone temples, when they allowed the spaces to be bridged more effectively, so you could have like an open room where you would have the cult statue placed towards the back towards the wall, so you could more easily see it. So we don't exactly know, when you just find a base for the cult statue, what kind of thing was on there. Was it a wooden statue or was it something else? But at some point, of course, in the 7th century BC, the Greeks start making stone sculptures, and that's when you get cult statues that also survive until the present day. They were also undoubtedly made of bronze at some point when they start making the larger bronze sculptures. We also know from Olympia and Athens the famous Elephantine statues of Zeus and Hera, made in the 5th century by Phidias. And Elephantine in that case means that they're made on some sort of skeletal structure, probably from bronze, and covered with gold and ivory. So these huge statues that were made of these valuable materials that have since then, of course, been lost because people steal that stuff when it's no longer being maintained. So, and the cult statue is basically the representation of this deity that is being venerated and housed in the temple. And unlike a church, maybe an important point to make, it's if you were a worshipper, you didn't congregate in the temple. You weren't supposed to go inside for the most part. Temples were usually the places where the priests would go in to officiate and take care of the cult statue, dust it off, place offerings, that sort of stuff. Usually you would only be able to see it during festivals that were organized, when they would open up the doors so that light could pour into the structure, and you would be able to see, as a worshipper, the statue representing the deity itself. You weren't supposed to go inside for the most part.
We've mentioned treasuries, which are at Olympia and Delphi, are where specific players would store their dedications. You would also find more dedications in the temple. More generally, that would be where they were stored in the centuries before treasuries were really a thing. It's another thing temples were used for. So they are sort of storage rooms as much as rather than churches. But typically, to circle back to it, the place where worship actually happened was at the altar, which was always outside in the open air.
Now, it's the big difference between a modern church, because in a modern church you're invited to come into the house of God, and God himself is not represented, of course, and the altar is inside to make sure that you go there, and you basically, the altar is the focal point for cult, whereas in ancient religion, the altar is outside, because you're not supposed to go inside the temple for the most part.
And it's warmer in Greece than it
also.
is. Yeah. And altars are often quite different. So there's the famous altar at Olympia, which is the ash from earlier sacrifices that just piles up and just gets bigger as time goes on.
Do we know what kind of rites were executed with the altars or around them?
Well, the altars are mostly sacrificial tables, basically. You would sacrifice an animal on there, burn part of it at least, and cook the rest. It's worth pointing out that, there are two things that in ancient Greek religion is important. One is making offerings, votive offerings mostly, so, weapons, armor, but also, if you have a disease, if you have pain in your hand, for example, you could go to a temple dedicated to Asclepius or Apollo, and you would dedicate a little terracotta hand and then say, please, deity, make sure that my hand gets better. The most important thing probably is the sacrifice, where a priest would be a procession, and you would go through the streets with a sacrificial animal, and you would go to the altar as a community, and there the animal would be slaughtered, cut into bits, butchered basically, and some of the inedibles wrapped in fat would be burned to the gods, so there would be lots of smoke, and the rest would basically turn into a giant barbecue, let's say, where everyone would be able to eat of the animal meat. And it was one of the few occasions in Greece that you can actually eat meat, because most people didn't eat meat on a regular basis. So that's an important social, shall we say, dietary aspect of religion in ancient Greece, that you have these occasions where you come together as a community and you eat, basically. And this also sort of ties in what we said more towards the beginning of the podcast, that there's this link between feasting and rulers, religion, community activities, and that's sort of a through line that you see throughout ancient history, basically, not just in Greece but elsewhere, of course.
If I remember right, Hans van Wees has actually written a pretty good article on competitive feasting, I think, or in the guise of competition in the that Classical Press of Wales volume on competition in the ancient world, that I have somewhere on one of my stupidly large number of bookshelves.
Yeah, of course. I mean, who do you invite is a powerful thing, of course. You see that. I mean, we haven't really talked about that yet, about how religion can be used to bring people together, but also to divide them. I mean, what's the role in a procession and a festival? There's a whole discussion you can have about, the role the different types of people had in these religious activities. The male citizenry were part of these activities. What about women? What about metics, resident foreigners? What about slaves? Not all of them participated in all of these activities, and we know that can be big social differences. For example, it's not entirely clear what the role was of women in Olympia throughout history.
I mean, as Matt just joked, obviously, about more modern times, religion is a very powerful othering device. I mean, we can see this in, again, looking at Delphi, a different Panhellenic sanctuary that we haven't talked about much. I think it's Herodotus notes that the treasury of Caere, an Etruscan city, was the first barbarian treasury allowed, and even, if we trust his language, which I think we probably should, the idea of allowing certain groups to build or not to build, or disallowing it, a treasury at one of these large sanctuaries is a very powerful tool that certain people within the Greek world had of maintaining differences between Hellenes and non-Hellenes.
Yeah, Croesus, the king of Lydia, of course, Herodotus describes as also the gifts that he gave and that were on display in Delphi. I mean, that's partially Croesus trying to, make friends with the Greeks on the mainland because, he's been conquering them in Asia Minor. I'm not all bad, folks. Here, have a I forget what it was, golden thing or whatever. Anyway, and but of course, on the part of the Greeks, they could also go and they would be like, "Ooh, look, this Asian potentate sent us this beautiful thing to honor the gods. He must be a swell guy." Look how wealthy he is.
Something I was thinking about women and athletics. So, but the problem is I can't remember all the details, so this is going to be vague. But we do have pretty good evidence that, as well as the more familiar men's athletic events at the regular Olympiads, also the Panhellenic Games and so on, from which we have prize amphoras and depictions of men engaged in sports. We also know that there were athletic events for women, or especially, I think, girls. And a major difference seems to have been that these athletic events were not sort of centrally held in the city or not held to great audiences as the men's athletics seem to have been. They were less public. Yeah, the focus was more on the ritual aspects of them, maybe is what I want to say. Because, of course, all these athletic festivals were partially, they are religious festivals, and they have a religious purpose, but like certain religious festivals today, they get commercialized. Whereas the girls' athletics does not seem to have had the same sort of attention paid to it. Might not be the right word. It may be that this was intentional, but it was that they kept the girls' athletics out of the way.
I was just going to say, I mean, if these were purposefully relegated to a lesser position, I mean, it would make sense because there is, throughout at least the periods of Greek history with which I'm more familiar, there is a socially maintained dichotomy between men and women, and it would make sense that, the ruling aristocratic males would try to keep these things separate, because once you have women starting to compete in more visible, athletic events, say in like the main stadium or whatever facility is being used for a specific event, say at Delphi, I mean, the general public will start to be more aware that, oh, wait, women are just the same as men. Why are we treating them as second-class citizens? I think there had to have been some realization that there was a risk in that for, the ruling male class.
Yeah, Mark Golden spends quite a lot of time in his Sport and Society in Ancient Greece about women competing in athletics, and he also mentions the emphasis on girls in particular at sanctuaries dedicated to Artemis, for example, where you have the girls referred to as little bears engaging in competitions with older women overseeing the competitions. But the emphasis there isn't really on competitiveness so much as on improving their physical health, let's say. So unlike with the men, where it's all very competitive, with the women they tend to sort of downplay the competitive element and more emphasize more the that engaging in this sort of stuff will make you a better woman and able to better bear children, undoubtedly, like also the Spartans had famously when they allowed women to exercise. Golden refers to sport about his book, Sport and Society in Ancient Greece, that he focuses on sport as a differing device.
So the specific example I was thinking of was the girls' games at the Sanctuary of Artemis at Brauron in Attica, which is 27 miles southeast of Athens. So while you have like the Panhellenic Games in the center of Athens, with the girls' athletics, if these are even remotely comparable, this is an event that's taking place really quite far away in somewhere quite separated from day-to-day life. This is something that is not as central to the public idea of who they are as the male games. Greece.
Maybe we should mention one thing is that, it's not a hard and fast rule, but in general, female deities tended to have priestesses. So female deities had priestesses and male deities had priests, male priests. This isn't a hard and fast rule. There were loads of exceptions. Also, Athena often had a male priest, but this was one of those areas where women in ancient Greece could have a position of authority outside of, say, the immediate dominion of a man. And there are depictions on vases, for example, of priestesses dangling keys, which were used to lock the doors to the temple, where, of course, all the valuables were kept. So one of the few cases where you can see where women have a slightly more prominent position, or could have a slightly more prominent position in ancient Greece. Priests in general, in ancient Greece you don't have a priest class, at least not in the historic era. Priests and priestesses in particular appear to have been far more important socially during the Aegean Bronze Age. But in the classical archaic and classical period, late archaic and classical period, at least when we have the sources for that, there wasn't a dedicated priesthood as such, so you couldn't have the priests sort of mobilizing their power like they could, for example, in ancient Egypt or in Mesopotamia.
It may be worth in that context, because I actually really don't know much about this at all, the process for choosing the priests who oversaw like the large, again, Panhellenic sanctuaries.
I'm not sure if we have any details as to how the priests were elected precisely, because I know that at one point Pisa at least plays an important part. Well, with the Panhellenic Sanctuaries, there are often the center also some disputes between polis who want to sort of dominate the how the sanctuary is run. But there was something with Pisa in Elis trying to exert influence over Olympia, but the details elude me. But I would assume that whichever polis sort of takes control of a sanctuary, that they would also be responsible for appointing the priests. But I'm not entirely sure. And maybe what we should point out is that a lot of sanctuaries also have, a power structure in themselves. They usually also own tracts of land, for example, because something that we haven't really touched upon is that you have this sacred precinct, which is also a refuge area for people. So if you've been politically exiled, you're a slave on the run, you're a criminal, and you need some place to stay safe to escape being hunted down and dragged to court and possibly executed or banished again, you could go into a sanctuary and you could become a supplicant. Usually you would go to the altar, you would to sort of say, save me from whatever harm might befall me, and then you'd be under the protection of the gods. That's one of the reasons, in a holy precinct, you're not allowed to engage in bloodshed. If you commit murder, you get ritual pollution, miasma. You then have to be purified. So it's one of the reasons you're also not allowed to have sex. You're not allowed to do anything. If women were having a period, usually they weren't allowed to go into a sacred precinct either, at least in the classical period, for fear of this religious pollution. So these, especially the larger sanctuaries, they usually had loads of land as well, so they had wealth of themselves, and this land was needed also to house all of these people, all of these supplicants who sought refuge at the temple, so they could stay there and not have to leave, like, say, the sacred ground in order to be captured and or killed.
An ancient monastery. Having just taught medieval history this past term, it sounds exactly like my description of early monasteries.
Part of that process about not allowing bloodshed and so on within the sanctuary is why we have, and again, this is about struggles for political control in the, I'm going to say 5th century, with the Delian League. Athens seems to have cleared out the graves from Delos and moved them onto another island, so that even long dead people were not supposed to be in the sanctuary, according to the Athenians. And it's a mixed blessing as an archaeologist, because you have this sort of nicely preserved deposit with all this pottery that is from Delos, but removes a lot of the original context as well. So yeah, mixed blessing. And then, of course, at other times, if you go to Delos, there's a huge Roman or Hellenistic city. There's a huge later city where clearly at this point no one cared if you lived, died, had sex, or anything in the sanctuary. Because people were doing that.
Anarchy! Glorious anarchy.
And, of course, now Delos is not populated. So in modern Greece, they've gone back to the old Athenian ideal where no one should be there.
there's a prohibition on actual violence in a sanctuary precinct. But there was provocation. I'm just thinking. I reread James Whitley's paper on hubris and Nike, his agency and dedication. Paper from a few years ago, and if I remember right, didn't at one point at I don't remember where it was, either Delphi or Olympia, the Argives dedicated a just like a pile of armor, helmets, and greaves that said that the Argives took these from the Corinthians and dedicated them to Zeus, so I guess it would be at Olympia, in like a really visible place. I mean, to me, obviously, it's not physical violence, but it is very much social antagonism. I mean, that had to have been a deliberate attempt to antagonize the Corinthians.
I don't know how much evidence we would have for where it was set up, because many of the arms and armor we know of at Olympia were used to construct the bleachers of the stadium. So we wouldn't have the original context. I think it's probably safe to assume many of these dedications were sort of on display in a way. Don't know.
Yeah, sorry, I've just flipped to the page in Whitley, and he does concede that in all probability, a quote there, it was first set up on the south side of the first stadium. So obviously not. I don't actually know his evidence for that. I don't see a citation. But so yeah, just to clear that up.
So the thing about, I believe this is the battle between Argos and Corinth that we only know about from these dedications, and it's a fairly substantial dedication. So we know that this conflict happened, but this is our only evidence for it. We have approximations of the date, and I think it is probably likely that it was somehow on display. But what I would tend to think of is more sort of the 5th century at Delphi, where you have like these war memorials being set up right along across from one another on the sacred way leading up to the temple. These are places of quite deliberate provocation, I think, these Panhellenic sanctuaries, certainly in this 6th and 5th century period.
I think it's important to remember that, though, because, when we describe sanctuary precincts as being, supposedly free from violence and all this, they weren't necessarily just the warm, fluffy place where you go to seek asylia if you're, running away from some people that you've wronged.
Yeah, just because you weren't going to kill one another while you were there doesn't mean you weren't going to remind one another that you don't like one another.
Prod the bear.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, especially the Panhellenic Sanctuaries were basically focal points for interstate rivalry, if you want to. I mean, they competed for everything there, the athletic competitions, but also the votive deposits and, of course, the treasuries, too, who can build the nicest treasury. I mean, if you look at Delphi with the Siphnian treasury, the Siphnians, when they built that in the 6th century, they probably went like, right, well, you try and best that.
It's kind of funny, at Delphi you actually get competition, or it's been argued by a few people now, that you get competition, or we see competition between Caere, the Etruscan city who was allowed to build a treasury there, and the Liparians, the Greek inhabitants of the Lipari Islands, north of Sicily. And it's just really, really interesting, because it's not just Greek-on-Greek competition, it's everyone who had access to these sanctuaries being able to compete with one another. The entire idea of building a building for worship itself can be othering. I mean, the walls themselves between you and the deity, and the fact that only one person has access to them, is a very distinct othering mechanism. And then, once you get to these treasuries and massive dedications being made, it's just, it spirals out of control to some sort of Catholic versus Protestant hell or nightmarish hellscape of, the 18th century.
Yeah, well, it sort of fits in with how transactional ancient Greek religion is. I mean, you want something from the deities, and then you make an offering, basically, to try convince the gods to support you. Or if something has happened that is fortuitous to you, you give an offering of thanks. It's, you don't really pray for moral support. You pray to get something out of it for the most part, and you pray to prevent the deities from harming you. You pray to Zeus to send good rains for the harvest, and that he won't send lightning to burn down your house. That's
kind of a prosperity gospel type thing.
Yeah, exactly, sort of that. So that's also a difference, I think.
And it was, it was more widespread than just in Greece, the transactional nature. If you look even like in Etruria, we have votive offerings of body parts, like you talked about earlier, that we assume were dedications to help or to ask for the gods' help in healing a specific issue. And, they range, you mentioned hands, but at least in Etruria, we see a lot of interesting things, even wombs.
There's loads of eyes, for example, because eye diseases were very common in ancient times. Because
a lot of genitals.
A lot of genitals as well.
Yeah.
Legs, arms, breasts, everything basically.
So thinking back and thinking, we didn't say anything about tripods.
One thing, that is interesting about tripods in particular, because they were such a popular dedication for athletes, is that there is a deeper tie, or I should say another tie, between the athletic competitions going on at these Panhellenic sanctuaries and the dedications themselves, because in the wake of a lot of these, you have dedications either by or for victorious athletes. And, these were ways to not only advertise the individual's athletic prowess, but, their hometown or their sponsors would often do this. And credit would be shared between the athlete and whoever sponsored them. The Sicilian tyrants, again, are the examples that I'm thinking of because I work on Sicily. But that there is more to the competitive agency of these things than just the military aspect that I brought up a couple of times.
The actual rewards for winning these athletic races, they're not substantial personal rewards. It's a wreath of differing leaves depending on which Panhellenic game you're competing at, or at the Panathenaic games, it's an amphora of olive oil. Then whatever your state gives you, whatever your sponsor gives you, however they support you. So the actual competition, it is it's not, you don't win a monetary prize, you win sort of kudos or godly
glory, basically. Yeah.
Glory, yeah, but also that's sort of adding into the fact this is a sacred, this is a religious act. These festivals, they are not about the prizes; they're about the activity.
But even then, eventually you get into a very competitive atmosphere if we, read into the significance of, almost everything that Pindar wrote. Celebrating various athletes and him, poets like him being commissioned to compose these praiseworthy songs to be sung, probably in more place than just the victorious athlete's hometown. There is, I think, a very human element to them eventually, to these games, that it does go beyond seeking some sort of glory with the gods or in the eyes of the gods on the part of the athletes. But obviously, that's later. That's once we get into very strong polis all competing in what eventually became a very small Greek world.
There is a competition with the building of these temples as well. So with the Temple of Zeus at Olympia, that is built by the Eleans, am I right? With their victory spoils from a war with Pisa, is that right? I'm trying to quickly look it up.
Well, already in Homer, you have Agamemnon at one point talking about how he sponsored the construction of a new roof to the temple. It's also an arena where the rich and the elites basically can say, I've sponsored this building. Unlike the later Romans, the Greeks don't put their names on there immediately. So it's less visible in that sense, but we do know that this sort of stuff happened.
Yes. Pausanias says that the temple and statue were built from the spoils won after the destruction of Pisa by Elis. This is from Boardman's Greek Sculpture, the classical period, because it's what I had to hand that would presumably tell me this. On the temple gable, the Spartans placed a shield to celebrate their victory over Argos at Tanagra in 457. Yes, so we're seeing these competitions. When we talk about spoils of war, earlier on we have the dedications of arms and armor, but here we have a temple being built with the spoils of war. But there are other sort of examples. So at Delphi in the 6th century, we have the Alcmeonidae paying to build the temple there, and that is sort of partially related to internal Athenian politics, it seems, as much as the Panhellenic politics there, that they are saying, look how important we are, as well as help us out, Apollo. We need to get rid of this Pisistratus guy who's messing things up. Please do not quote any of that on Athenian politics in the 6th century. It's been a while. But that is, the gist of it is that often the people who are in power will use public works to say, look at this good thing I did for you. And temples are a good indication of that.
Yeah, the Denomenids did, similar in Syracuse. It's probably good to give an example of of in Polis temple building in that vein. After the Battle of Himera traditionally did it to 480 between Syracuse and Akragas or Agrigentum against an alliance of other Greek tyrants and the Carthaginians. Supposedly the spoils were quite great, and Gelon, the tyrant of Syracuse at the time, was reinvested in a couple of temples in the city, if I remember right, including the Temple of Athena that I think I've written something for Ancient World magazine on before, because it still stands. It's actually the Duomo of Syracuse now.
Yeah, you wrote about that. Yeah.
Something of a counter-example, or not so much a counter-example, but a different aspect of this is the Temple of Olympian Zeus in Athens, which is a huge temple that was started under the Pisistratids that then stood incomplete for 700 years, 600 years, until, I think it was Hadrian who finished it. So there is an example of a historical figure being associated with a building, but because of the negative associations of that figure, this building was not completed. Oh yeah, I was just thinking about in 2013 with my then future in-laws, we went sailing around some of the Greek islands. But something you notice sort of coming around the cape at the cave of Sounion at the southern tip of Attica is how visible this Temple of Poseidon that stands there is in that sanctuary. And I don't want to put too much emphasis on this because I don't know how far it maps, but certainly there is a sense that visibility, and of course the temple now is entirely white marble, which makes it more reflective, and we don't know quite how it would have been painted when it was completed. But that gives it sort of this shining visibility that might mean as you were sailing home to Athens, you would spy that and it's like, oh, here we are, home territory. It's another aspect to how temples and sanctuaries mark territory, not just on land, but also traveling overseas.
And that will do for today's episode. If you enjoy what we do, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/ancientworldmag. Our thanks to our patrons for supporting us, and in particular we'd like to give a shout out to Rachel K. Bignell, who has been supporting us for quite a while. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Be sure to visit us on ancientworldmagazine.com, and until next time, bye bye.